If you've attended one of our other sessions before, you know me very well at this point. My name is Jennifer Hewins, and I'm the Assistant Director for Graduate Admissions. With us today, I have the faculty from Landscape Architecture and Interior Architecture Adaptive Reuse. With that, I'll turn it over to Emily. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Emily Vogler. I'm a landscape architect and environmental planner. I've been teaching at RISD for going on more than 12 years, I think it is now that I've been at RISD. I'm an associate professor and I teach classes related to water mostly. So looking at rivers and coastlines and how to improve public access, increase habitat, and address climate change.
Fantastic. Thank you, Emily. John?
Hello, everyone. My name is Can Altay. I'm an associate professor at the Interior Architecture Department. I'm also the graduate program director of the MDes Adaptive Reuse program. And I've been teaching for over 20 years, not at RISD though, in other places, but I've been at RISD for almost 2 years now. And my own practice is very much related to space. I studied interior architecture and environmental design, and that led me to a kind of develop a body of work that finds its place in public spaces as well as cultural environments such as museums. And at the interior architecture department, I currently teach thesis projects and thesis prep classes.
Perfect. Wonderful. Thank you so much. All right. This session is an entirely Q&A session, so 1 hour for your questions. So feel free to start dropping your questions in the Q&A section of Zoom. If you put them in there, it allows me to answer them in the order that they come. And I'll be putting some helpful links as we go over topics in the chat. So I don't want to lose any questions in the chat. To get us started with our first question, I have an icebreaker. And John and Emily, if you wanted to answer this question. When reviewing portfolios, what qualities or approaches tend to stand out to you the most?
You want me to jump in first?
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay, excellent. So within landscape architecture, we tend to get some applicants that come in with a background in design, but also a lot of applicants who are coming in with a wide range of backgrounds. And it's something that we actually love about our department is that we do have such a mix of students with different backgrounds. And so we fully understand that some people might be applying and do not necessarily have a full design portfolio put together. And so one of the main things that we are looking for when we're looking at a portfolio, no matter what a student's background is just getting a better understanding of how they're looking at the world and the types of questions that they're asking as they're looking around the built environment. So whether that is photographs where you're specifically kind of explaining what it is that you're looking at, whether that's sketches, or any previous work that you might have done, whether that is from design or any other artistic practices that show your ability to think through drawing, think through making, whatever it is that helps us to see that kind of relationship that you have with where you might be going in terms of the discipline. So I think that's the main thing that we're looking for. I think if students are coming in from a design background, one thing, especially right now in the age of AI, is just really helpful for us to understand more than just a kind of pretty picture, what it is that you're trying to communicate through your design work. And so understanding a project and the approach you took to the project, if it's teamwork, helping us to understand what specific role you played in the team is really helpful. And that goes also for any sort of professional work. But I think, like I said, the main thing we're looking for is, we understand that everybody's coming with a range of backgrounds. So whatever it is that gives us a sense of who you are and the way you see the world, I think is what we mostly are trying to understand through a portfolio.
Great. Thank you, Emily.
I mean, in our case, I think it's pretty much similar. Everything Emily mentioned really kind of matter to us as well greatly, perhaps in the context of interior architecture, which is ultimately about how we transform existing built environment and how we experience the spaces we inhabit. We really kind of care about you don't have to have the kind of background or knowledge. Same with us for both MDes programs. We enroll students, we admit students from different backgrounds, as well as design and architecture backgrounds. But I think it's kind of one thing that matters a lot to us is like this kind of attention and inquisitiveness. So, I mean, it's like when you are entering a space, when you are kind of transforming a space or a building from within, it needs a certain kind of attention to be able to unpack and highlight or introduce new values, highlight the existing values or introduce new values to that current existing space. And with that, I think we are looking at not only the kind of visual content of your portfolio, but how it correlates with your letter of intent as well. I tend to kind of cross-read them, like I go back and forth between them to kind of figure out where you are coming from, what you care about, what are your intentions coming into this or applying to this program in particular, and what are your aspirations, what are your expectations from the program. All of them kind of collide. And with just to echo what Emily said, it then doesn't necessarily mean that you need to, if you don't have a design background, first of all, you don't need to pretend to be an interior designer or an interior architect per se. It's like what you've done in your actual kind of life matters a great deal. So instead of kind of mocking up a portfolio that resembles design work, if you haven't done any design work, you don't need to have any design work in your portfolio, but you can, I think we can still read some kind of information about you through the other visual outlets that you've worked on. So that's really important. And again, I'm kind of repeating what Emily said a little bit, but if you are coming from a design or architecture background, then it's also really crucial how you intend to kind of transform your own practice as well, because you are coming to RISD, to IntAr, or to landscape to learn a different way of doing things rather than repeating what you've done thus far. It's really important for us to understand what you've done so far, but the kind of and it's really not tangible what I'm gonna say, but the kind of potentials that are visible in your portfolio really matter to us.
Perfect. Excellent. Thank you so much. All right. Emily, this question's specific for landscape architecture. This person has an architecture background. So how does the landscape architecture program at RISD differ from a traditional architecture program? And how does it differ from other MLAs? What's the ratio between being out in nature, in the field, and being in the studio?
Yeah, those are all great questions. So I think to the first question about how it differs from an architecture background, I think one of the main things for me that stands out about how we approach sites is that we think in a very multi-scalar way within landscape architecture. So we're always trying to think, if we have a site, we're always trying to also think beyond that to the larger region, and then to the site scale, or to the region scale, the city scale, the site scale, and then the kind of material scale. And within our program at RISD, we're constantly kind of working back and forth so that we could understand the larger regional context we're working in, whether that's looking at issues of biodiversity or looking at issues of river systems or climate change, but then being able to really zoom into a site. And the reason why that's really important, and one of the main things we work with, are living systems. We're kind of lucky in that we get to work with this wild natural world that's around us, these kind of human systems and ecologies that intersect on sites. And so a big part of that is just understanding how to learn about these living systems that we're working with, and how to both read them within the landscape, but then also to learn how we can then change them or manipulate them depending on the goals of a project. And so I think that way of specifically working with those living systems is really unique to the field of landscape architecture. So whether that's looking at, kind of plant material and understanding where and how the different plants that we're using tie into that larger ecosystem that you're designing within, is a really important part of what we focus on. Same with kind of water and the way we think about water. right? We can't ever think about a site that's a riverfront site or a coastal site in isolation without understanding all of the different flows that are coming onto the site and everything that's then going to run off of the site, right? So always thinking across these different scales is necessary when we're working with these living systems. And I think that that is particularly unique to the way that we practice as landscape architects, and that's different from the way that traditional architecture has been taught. There are definitely schools and programs that are shifting their approach to the way they think about architecture, but it kind of depends on what your background is. But we're always, we work a lot with plants. We work a lot with the ground specifically. We teach, and I really pride myself in the fact that we really teach our students how to grade, understanding how to work with ground, manipulate ground, depending on the different goals of a project. Obviously, depending on how we change the grade of a site or the topography of a site, it affects runoff. It affects how, water will flow or how tides will influence a site. It affects what plants will grow there. And it also affects the human experience of being in that space. And so we teach, and our students come out with a lot of skill in grading, or kind of, working with contours in order to communicate and design sites and topography. And to me, I feel like that's a really unique skill that we have. Within landscape architecture. And so all those different living systems, the water, the ground, the soil, the plants, and also the human systems as well, and understanding what it means to be working often within a public realm is also extremely important, because within landscape architecture, the way that we teach, we're very much specifically focused on public projects and on the design of public space. And so what does it mean? Within architecture, you're often designing something that's enclosed and by nature tends to have a kind of private element because of the walls. Whereas within landscape, we're dealing with, spaces that are entirely public, and so, or semi-public. And so where and how do we begin to think about those different social factors and how our designs can respond to that as well? So it's kind of this understanding of all these different systems that are influencing a site and then the way that we work with them. What I think is unique about our program at RISD is the fact, we very much always ask ourselves this question of, we're a landscape architecture program within an art and design school. And what does that mean in terms of the way that we teach and the way that we approach the field? And so one thing that we try to do is kind of really think about some of the kind of artistic and material aspects of our work and our practice, but always within that kind of multi-scalar way, right? So if we're thinking about a material, whether that is, wood, how do we begin to understand where that wood is coming from, right? At that kind of larger regional scale, what does that mean in terms of the impacts of extraction? Or if we're designing a coastal environment and we're dealing with issues of erosion, how do we begin to think differently about how we could address that erosion through structural and non-structural design solutions? And so, we might get down to the scale of designing a module that can be helped to address erosion, but we're understanding that always within that context, the larger issues that we're trying to address, right? So that ability to really develop, that ability to work across those scales, to me, becomes critical to explore where and how our artistic practices and material practices can actually make an impact on these larger issues, whether they're environmental or social, that so many people are kind of interested in addressing right now. And I think that is very unique to our program, and we tend to take a much more hands-on approach. So we do pride ourselves in our first years. Our first semester is all done by hand. We teach students how to hand draft. We build a lot of models by hand. We think about models not only as a final product once the design is is drawn and completed, but actually as a way of working and thinking through a project. And so to me, that ability to work with our hands and to understand those kind of materials that we're working with is really key. So whether that's our artistic media of drawing, or whether that is the actual materials that we're working with on a site, the plants, the soil. So kind of tying into your last question, one of the things we do a lot is we get out into the field, right? So we could actually learn to observe and learn the material qualities of plants and of soils. So in our first semester, we're out in the field digging soil pits that are 6 feet deep. So we could get down and really understand the soil section and how that changes from a beach environment to an upland environment. And so we do try to get out in the field in order to really understand these places that we're designing for. And so I think, it depends. The first year, especially the first fall semester, we spend a lot more time out in the field. The students are actually right now out at a site doing a month-long installation, a kind of design build, which is great because they're out in the elements, they're working with the site, they're understanding the different site systems that they're kind of engaging with on a day-to-day basis. So that first fall semester is very intensely out in the field. The winter session is a little bit harder because it's the middle of winter. The spring is a little bit harder because it's the middle of spring, but we do still get like early kind of February, March, and April in Rhode Island can be really wet and cold still. But we do still do kind of field trips. We look at local sites in that first year, so we could spend a lot of time out on sites. But then as you progress into the rest of the curriculum, it kind of depends on the classes that you're taking in terms of how much time you're spending outside. We definitely have other advanced elective studios and also seminars that are specifically field-based. We have one seminar, it's a kind of test plot where the students are working with a faculty member to transform a lawn into a meadow. And it's like every year they're just out there trying to figure out what does it actually take to make this happen, right? It's easy to say, let's convert this lawn to a meadow, but what does it actually take? And how do we actually learn from that process of monitoring, studying how the different plants are performing, understanding the different species that are using that space versus another space. And so we do have some classes that are much more field-based that students can take. In terms of the amount of time specifically, I will not lie, there's a lot of time that students spend in the studios behind their computers. That is just the nature of learning some of the skills of our profession. So I would say in the first year, it's maybe 60 to 70% in the studios and 30 to 40 out in the field. But that changes as you move forward in the program. But that's just kind of a rough percentage, not really based on calculations. But we do try to get out in the field. And I do think that is something that is quite unique about our approach and how we were really thinking about, like, how do we get to know our materials? And what is, for a potter, they work with clay, right? For landscape architects, we work with the landscape. We work with the kind of those natural systems that I mentioned. So getting intimate and familiar with them is important.
Perfect. Thank you, Emily. And I just want to also note, I'm going to do an event plug here. If you have more questions about the curriculum, the program itself, sign up for our online open house. I dropped a link for that in the chat. There will be a dedicated session for each of our graduate degree programs during that week, so you can learn more in depth about each program and ask those nitty-gritty questions then. But to dive back into the portfolio questions, this question is specific for interior architecture, John, but I think, you both can speak to this. For interior architecture and adaptive reuse, how many projects, and we get this question a lot, how many projects should be included in the portfolio and how many is too many?
Well, I mean, that's a great question. It really depends. I mean, I also saw a couple of questions that were talking about conveying a design identity versus a range. I would say a range of possibilities is better if you have a kind of a body of work that encapsulates process, making, because again, like being at RISD, I think a kind of significant difference that our programs posit is the relationship to making and hands-on learning, working in both scale and full scale, working directly with materials, as well as, let's say, software and other manual methods such as drawing and model making. We really invest in kind of at least partial full-scale prototypes to have a real sense of the objects or materials or the kind of a portion of the space potentially. So those kinds of things, if you've dabbled in kind of handiwork that could even come into play in your portfolio, there's really not a limit. I mean, there is a limit because it's maybe we can touch on the kind of slide room format, the way RISD admits portfolios is very specific. So it needs you to be very concise and economic and very, in a sense, decisive about how you want to portray yourself and your work. Because there's a limit to the number of slides, there's a kind of limit to the span of work that you can include. But I wouldn't want to kind of put a number on it because it really depends on what you've done. Maybe you'll just focus on one project to really show us the depth you can go, or maybe you'll kind of focus on your range and place 10 different projects, but kind of touch on them briefly, or different facets of each project that you worked on. So it really depends, but yeah, I mean, I hope that replies it.
Most definitely, for sure. We've gotten this question, this almost same exact questions 2 or 3 times between the chat and the Q&A. And perhaps both of you can speak to this. How important is it to include process work, sketches, research, material studies versus renderings?
I mean, again, I can go.
Yes.
I would say very important. I mean, of course, renderings can be kind of dazzling images when you are kind of showing them to perhaps non-professionals. But we as professionals and academics in the field want to really peek into the thinking behind those renderings. So it's for us as IntAr, I'm sure Emily would agree, but it's super important. It's even more important than the quality of your renderings is the kind of how you thought, how your thinking process took place, how you approached the site or the host building, or how you approached the problem at hand, and what did you dissect from your observations and then propose new transformations or new additions to an existing site or a building or whichever field you are coming from. Maybe you are coming from product design, then it's about a different process, but still it's crucial for us to kind of peek into the process and your way of thinking, your way of approaching, and your way of tackling problems, addressing them.
Absolutely. I would 100% echo everything that John just said about the kind of the thinking behind the project. And I think one of the recommendations I would give is that sometimes when students are putting together their portfolio, it's hard to edit out, right? And to choose what to include and what not to include. And sometimes it's tempting to put a lot into a portfolio and to like cram it all in there and make everything really small. But then it's really hard to actually for us to see some of the drawings and to see some of the work. So in some cases, less can be more, just for the legibility of a portfolio. And so just thinking about when you're organizing your portfolio, thinking about what's really critical for us to see to understand that thinking behind. And so it might be, one process sketch and then one final drawing, right? And all of a sudden we could see what the thinking was behind it and then where it landed in terms of that kind of the final kind of deliverable, the final outcome of it. And so maybe those 2 are sufficient instead of 10. So I think that's just going to be one of the challenges that everybody always faces when they're working on a portfolio is thinking about where and how to edit out and to include those key things for us to understand the thinking behind the project.
Okay, thank you.
And I think, I mean, we are all aware that most likely some of you at least are applying to multiple kind of places or positions or schools, and the same will apply in your professional life as well. It's really important to tailor the portfolio to the place that you are applying. So not a one-size-fits-all portfolio, but really kind of consider what the program you are applying to is focusing on, and also consider how you want to portray yourself vis-a-vis in relation to that particular program and school, and you really try to tailor it. This is beyond RISD, this is a general kind of recommendation, but don't just kind of build one portfolio and fire it all around. Really be attentive and mindful of what you are sending where. And we can read read into those, we are all experienced enough to kind of see what types of portfolios we are receiving. So
That's an excellent point, John. And this leads into, I've got this question twice now. Do we include a cover page, table of contents, CV? So applying to grad school is different than applying for a job. So for your application for grad school, we just want to see the work itself. Don't take up space with like a cover page and table of contents and a CV. You'll be able to put your CV and your resume and the application itself. But let the application portfolio just be your work itself. And now, Emily, I know landscape architecture has some specific requirements for the portfolio that's different from the regular 10 to 20 images of visual work. Can you speak a little bit about exactly what it is that landscape is looking for that's outside of the general requirement?
Mhm. I think the one main thing that we're asking for in addition to the portfolio is the video. We ask for a short 2-minute video from all the applicants. And I think what's important to recognize in this is we're not asking you to make a highly polished, kind of highly edited video. It's just helpful for us to hear you speak about why it is you're passionate about pursuing a degree in landscape architecture. And for us, that gives us a better sense of who you are, what your interests are. So it can be as casual as just a iPhone video as you're walking through a landscape and telling us what you're seeing, or it could just be talking about some of your past experiences or what you're specifically hoping to pursue. I think we have a couple of questions that are written out on the admissions website that kind of guide that conversation. But, similar to this, unfortunately, we're not able to see your faces right now, but it's helpful. It's just helpful to be able to, it's the closest thing we can do to have a conversation with you all prior to or during that admissions process. And it's really intended just to begin that conversation. And so hopefully you all will also attend some of our open houses or come visit the department. But the video is just helpful as we're reading through all your materials and trying to get a sense of who you are and what your interests are. And so I think that's the major difference. I think the only other thing is that we ask, I think specifically for 10 images, there's a bit of flexibility on that. I think one of the main things is just, like I said previously, I think that originally came from getting a lot of portfolios that had a lot of information in them that was just a bit overwhelming. And so we're just, we're looking for you to just think about how you curate your materials and editing down what you're selecting.
Fantastic. Thank you, Emily. Right. There's a lot of similar questions in here, so I'm just weeding them through.
I would just add one thing while you're reading that, in terms of the portfolio, like John said, we're just trying to get a sense of how you're thinking through your work and also who you are and what the questions you're asking or you're interested in. And that's partially going to be based on your own life experience and your own backgrounds. And so, we've had students, who in their portfolio included like a photograph of like, I biked across the country, and here's like a way I curated this kind of story of that experience, And so for us, those types of ways that you've explored and been in the world are equally important, right? We like it when people come to us with their own life experiences and their own ways of seeing the world. And so even though that might not seem like it fits within a traditional portfolio, those type of life experiences are also just helpful to communicate and can be done through a series of photos or through other ways of describing, kind of a mapping or whatever it is that tells of some of those experiences and adventures that you've been on in life, that have shaped the way that you're looking at the world now.
This is an
absolutely.
interesting.
Sorry.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
No, I was just saying absolutely.
This person comes from an interesting background. They have a physics background, but they've also taken a few courses in architecture. How would you recommend showing both aspects of their undergraduate experience? Most of their work has been spent in physics and conducting experiments, but I do also have studio work from architecture classes.
Mm-hmm. Should I give it a go? I don't know
Please,
which.
please.
I mean, it is definitely an interesting background, and if there is a way in which you can kind of let us know about it or have a sense of it through a visual interface, that would be amazing. But it can also be maybe there's a paper you wrote that you think is relevant, or maybe there was an assignment you undertaken that you think could be relevant. All of those would work. I wouldn't necessarily kind of focus on only the coursework that you've done in the architecture context that you're mentioning. I would try to incorporate other facets, but also just as Emily just said, also your kind of personal story could come into, like, what drove you to physics and architecture as a combination. I think that's also, there's something, obviously an interesting story there, and now you decided to pursue kind of more in a kind of architectural adjacent or design related field. So how did that happen? Is there a way in which you can kind of convey that story through visuals in your portfolio as well as your letter of intent? I think would be the interesting approach.
Thank you, John. That actually segues into another question when you mentioned the letter of intent or the statement of purpose. How much weight does the portfolio have in admissions compared to your statement of purpose and the other elements in the application? Everybody talks about the portfolio, but I think I can speak for everybody that the application is reviewed holistically. So in the statement of purpose, letters of recommendation, they all have weight. But is there anything that you wanted to add to that?
I think each program tackles it differently. Obviously, the landscapes video idea is very interesting as well. I can be totally transparent. The way we approach the applications is that not a single person looks at it. It's assessed by a number of faculty from our department, and we then kind of exchange notes, ideas, and kind of reflections on each of your applications. And there's not a set percentage, but because some of you might have a very strong portfolio, but maybe not be as verbally strong, but some of you, for some of you, the case will be, the reverse, where your kind of statement of purpose is really kind of what drives your application. And along with that, there are also recommendation letters. There are also, like, who is kind of authoring your recommendation letter? What are they kind of suggesting or focusing on? Like, all of these things kind of combined allows us to gain a 360 picture about you as much as possible. It's of course kind of through these interfaces. But then we kind of exchange notes, and then we decide on the kind of long list and then the short list to say, to kind of build a kind of admission process in terms of who would be the ideal candidates for this year's cohort.
Great.
Yeah. And I would just add to that, I think, this, I think before, John, you had mentioned like the kind of the way that the letter of intent reflects and is then reflected in the portfolio is really helpful for us to see, right? And so in that process of going back and forth, it's kind of, how do you tell your story, and just thinking about that and thinking about where and how you craft that story in terms of what your background is, where and how that led you to where you are today, and then where you're hoping to go, by studying at RISD. And that's really just helpful, and it allows for us to understand, like, yeah, you might not be coming in with a design background, but you have all this other really interesting kind of life experience or work experience. And it helps us to get a sense then of where and how you might contribute to the departments, and then the type of work you might be interested in pursuing. And so helping, I think, just thinking through how to craft that story and how that gets reflected in between those different documents you're submitting is helpful.
Great, thank you. I think you can both speak to this question. Should the portfolio reflect a clear design identity or demonstrate a range of skills and interests? we get this question often in our other sessions as well, like, do you want to see like what their toolkit is, like their different skills, or do you really want them to just focus on what they're interested in specifically and, you know, what they wish to pursue here?
Mhm. I can jump in, and maybe I'll pull in one of the other questions I saw in the question and answer from an applicant who's coming from, you know, I know a lot of people are not coming from a design background, right? And so for a lot of you, you might be like, have like a design, you know, identity. It's like, what, how, now? And so I think that to me is a little bit less important personally. I think, you know, what we're looking for, at least in our department, is less of a kind of clear design identity and more of a kind of willingness to jump in and try new things. You know, the main thing that we're looking for in the portfolio part of it, even if you're coming from a non-design background, is like that you can think spatially and that you can also just begin to draw, right? Like, because we teach a lot of drawing in our department, so we're not expecting everybody to come in with a lot of drawing experience, but having just a sketch, right, or a couple of sketches that show the way that you're trying to understand the world and represent the world through drawing is helpful for us, right? So that's going to be very different than a student who might be coming in with a design background and already might, yes, have a more clear design identity. But I think I'd be less interested in, I'm often less interested in like a very polished, like every project we're just seeing these kind of pretty final images like John was mentioning earlier, but I think we want to see that messy process. We want to see the way that you work, right? And so showing a wider range of the design process through a project is really helpful, rather than just kind of, here's my identity, right? Because that's going to change, right? Hopefully in your experience at RISD, that will be affected by your studies, right? And so I think just showing us you know, kind of everything from that kind of early design stages, how you might begin to sketch if you're coming from a design background, and then where and how that evolves into a final project. And then if you're not coming from a design background, showing just a willingness to jump in and try, right? So just go out into, you know, somewhere in the city or wherever you are and just sketch, you know, and that's great practice for all of us in general in life. It's just a wonderful way to spend time, but it's gonna, and if you are pursuing a degree in the architectures, it's just helpful skill to begin to build. But also then by including that in your portfolio, it shows both a willingness to jump in and try something new, and also just shows us like, okay, yeah, you will be able to pick up some of these skills, because that is sometimes challenging, especially for students who are coming from without any sort of design or art background. We are a visual discipline, right? We communicate our ideas through drawings. And so for some students, that is extremely difficult. And so testing that for yourself right now in this application process could also help you decide if that's really how you want to be communicating and the kind of field that you want to be working in. And so that would be my recommendation for those of you coming from a design background and also a non-design background.
And also, I mean, ultimately, we are all assuming that you are kind of applying to RISD and to willingness to come here to learn, to grow, and to transform. So that willingness and that openness is important. If you have such a kind of strong or fixed design identity, as you mentioned, then maybe it may be a challenge for us to see you in that growth environment. I mean, it may or may not be. I cannot judge without seeing any of these, but there is a risk that kind of that brings with it. Maybe you feel like your portfolio feels like you're already established it too strict, or, you know, like too fixed of a kind of position or identity. Then maybe we may ask, or your reviewer might ask, will you be open to change? Will you be open to kind of the learning experience that RISD is going to bring to you? So I think that openness and willingness is really crucial. And maybe I mean, I've also glanced at some of the questions, Jan. So, and just to tie up a couple to also perhaps help you, we can tie that up with there were some questions about design build work, and then there were some questions about professional work in a kind of office environment. And we touched on that. I think Emily touched on that already in the first kind of statement. But I think it's important to include them, but it's also important to really highlight your role, your contribution, and your position within, because most often a design build project or an office work project will be a teamwork, right? So your position and your contribution within that team is super important. I would even extend that to coursework where, like, I don't know, you can even include which kind of course that project was undertaken in, or who were the course leaders for that project. You know, all of those informations, or was it a single, like, individual project, was it a group project, like, all of those are really important. And the kind of the transparency that you bring to the fort in underlining your contribution to each item in your portfolio is critical, and we kind of read into that. And there was another question about sequence, which I think is really important, like whether to think of it as chronologically or whether to build a narrative. I would say definitely build a narrative. Like, you don't, I mean, as Jan mentioned, you have a kind of limited space to also grab our attention, your reviewers' attention. So it's really crucial, like, how you start and how you kind of build a sequence of projects. If you start from, unless it's like really relevant to your story, if you start from the very early kind of beginner stage projects, maybe you lose some of the attention of your reviewers. I mean, we go through them, all of them, with the utmost attention, but it's really important to kind of invest in the narrative that you are building through that portfolio. So it's not necessarily only of strong project or beginner project or advanced project, but it's also about how you build a sequence in kind of telling a story through those images and through those pages, through those projects that convey to us, like, who you are, what you do, where you stand, what you are interested in, what you are competent, what you are confident about, and also what you are competent, your competency in. So yeah, I would say, I mean, I personally would not recommend going chronological. Maybe Emily might disagree, but
No, I think the structuring of the portfolio is part of the creative process of putting it together, and thinking about, I often tell students, you don't have to include every project, like because I do a lot of portfolio reviews for our students as they're applying for jobs, and it's like, you don't have to include all of them. And sometimes what's helpful is, like, for those of you coming from a design background, yes, it might make sense to organize your portfolio by project. For those of you not coming from a design background, that might not make any sense, right? Because you don't have what might be considered traditional projects. And so we're open to students thinking creatively about how to structure the portfolio. Like, it might be around themes, like, and so it might be that you have certain themes that you're interested in, and that there's different ways that you want to tell about how that interest has been influenced your life, right? Or how in your experience, your work experience, your whatever it is that your undergrad degree. Or you might choose to organize it based on, I don't always recommend this, but, like, sometimes students are like, oh, I want to draw, like, show my, like, hand sketches versus models versus final drawings, right? I generally, I prefer to, if it's one project, I like to see it together so I could see those sequence of how a project evolved. But if you're coming from a non-design background, and you don't have traditional projects, you can think other ways of how to organize your portfolio as well. So just kind of encouraging you all to think of how you craft that story, and how you think about, just what the different organization structures might make sense. But definitely don't feel like you have to do it chronologically, because to us that, just unless there's a story in that, right? If there's a story in the chronology, right, of how your skills developed or how your interests evolved, then that might be helpful, right? But then you might need to tell us about that through the text, so we understand what it is that you're wanting to draw our attention to. So what I would say is, when putting your portfolios together, just to think, what do I want to be saying with this image, or what do I want to be talking about my interest through showing this work? And if you don't, and sometimes the written text can be extremely helpful for us to see what it is that you want us to be seeing or looking at in the work, right? If that is about the progression, or that's about some kind of specific interest that you have, feel free to be a bit explicit in the captions about what it is that you want us to be looking at, or what it is that you were thinking about when making the work.
Yeah. And aside from the kind of video and the kind of focus of the program bits that Emily has been talking about, everything that she has mentioned right now and also before applies to the interior architecture and there's applications as well. These are kind of, so I hope you're all paying attention to what has been said, because they totally apply to both programs, in my opinion.
Absolutely. And same on the other way as well. Everything that John's been mentioning is also relevant.
Perfect. Thank you. Yes, we get the question a lot, and we, reiterate in the admissions office that we don't need to see all of your work. We just curating is part of the challenge for the portfolio assignment here. And then for landscape architecture, you specifically mentioned 10 individually produced or carefully chosen images of your work. For interior architecture, it's a little bit broader, where it's 10 to 20 images of visual work. People always get like hung up on that, and they want, so it's specifically just 10 images or 10 to 20 visual pieces of your work. They want to dissect that a little bit. Is that 10 projects? Is it, and that just goes back to just saying less is sometimes more here. We just want to see a curated range of some of your best work, or that, describes who you are.
And I mean, that partly relates to the format of uploading your applications, your kind of the work, the portfolio part of your applications. And the current, let's say, software or interface is structured in a way that you upload page by page. For interior architecture, both MDES adaptive reuse and also the E&E programs, both of our programs, I would recommend thinking of them potentially as slides on a deck or pages on a kind of portfolio, so that it's not only about the single image, but you can create composite images, you can create a layout, page layout that kind of conveys the ideas through multiple images. But again, something Emily touched on is the not overloading each page aspect of things. So it doesn't need to be a single image. You can have multiple images in one page, and that could be the image that you are uploading to the slide room. But if you overload it, just always keep in mind that we are looking at your portfolios not on a huge projection, but through the confines of our screen. Most often it's a laptop or a desktop screen that the reviewer is kind of viewing your work in. So if you intensely make a layout that has like huge amount of images that are tiny, that asks us to zoom in, or like all of those things, that's not gonna work. So the economy also comes into play there, like the visual economy of like what kind of hierarchy you want to build through, if you are using multiple images, how you compose them as a composition within the page, how that works with the kind of textual supporting elements of each of those images or the total project. But they all need to be legible. Like if we end up having to zoom in to each slide, then I think we are losing a little bit of steam in our interest, and also potentially it's more likely that we will miss out some of the elements that you wanted us to see.
Absolutely. Everything that John just said was spot on for the way that we think about the portfolios. And I think specifically thinking about that hierarchy of information on a page is really important. And so, for example, if you're wanting to talk about a project, you might have one large image and then maybe a series of diagrams underneath, right? And that's a way that you can clearly have multiple images on one page, but there's a clear hierarchy, right? And so I think that's just something that you're we probably all are developing, and it's this skill of composition, and it's not easy, but I would just say that it is extremely important, because I know what happens for myself personally. Like when I get something that has a lot of small images that I have to zoom in and out, I just kind of glaze over and I go to the next slide, right? And so you don't want that to happen, right? So just that editing. And I would just say about our requirements, we're not going through and counting the images, right? But we're just asking for you to think carefully about that curation.
Excellent. And if you have any questions, tomorrow night, admissions, myself and my colleague will be hosting a webinar where we go through the actual mechanics of Slide Room. We'll go through the steps of when you get your instruction email from admissions, creating your Slide Room account, into how it will look on your end and how it will look on the end of the reviewer, how to utilize the description section of Slide Room. And so I encourage you to sign up for that session just to learn more. And if you haven't already, just get started on your application and start playing around with Slide Room. You don't have to submit it yet, but just get comfortable with the system. Don't wait until right before the deadline.
I think that's a really important point, Jan, like not to wait until the last day. Also, something might go wrong, like you might lose, I don't know, it rarely happens now, but you might lose internet connection or like, I don't know, anything can happen. So it's better to start early and kind of figure it out and
Yeah.
then make the application, don't wait for the ultimate deadline.
Yeah, so deadline is January 5th. That's right before our winter break here at campus. Admissions will continue to be working. We'll be answering emails, but we won't be as prompt as if we're working on a regular schedule. So to save yourself some peace of mind, so if there's a delay in communications, just get started early, get those questions in now. There's one question as we're nearing the end of our session that nobody's asked yet, but what are some common mistakes that you see in the application or things that people should avoid doing?
Okay, that needs a little bit of thinking, but the first thing that comes to my mind is not being transparent about their role and contribution within a group or a professional project. I think that's a big kind of faux pas. That's kind of we immediately flag that if like it's a matter of authorship, it's a matter of like academic integrity, so that would be my biggest red flag, so to say. The first thing that comes to my mind is not being transparent about the individual. And your contribution can be tiny, but you may have learned a lot from that process and working in that project, and you want to include that. That's all fine, but you need to be kind of explicit about your role and the degree of your contribution to that particular project. Another one we touched on is like overloading each slide with like too many images or too many texts or too small. I think the text image balance is also like, I mean, the slide room is very image oriented, but of course, each applicant also includes some text into their slides to kind of help us understand and help us navigate through the images. And there again, the kind of the decision around how much text to include or how little to include, those kind of things are also really critical. So not overloading each slide with images, but also not overloading each slide with a lot of text. I mean, the textual part is more on the kind of statement of purpose, but of course include the bits and pieces that help us navigate the images, but you don't need to kind of write a small essay on each project as part of your slides.
Great. Thank you, John.
I would just reiterate the first point that John made. I think it's by far the most important for all of us that, that there's clarity in the roles that you played in any images or work that you're sharing. We value teamwork, and so we want to see that you have participated in a team. So celebrate that, but just be clear, because if not, then when you come to our program, it'll, we'll be able to see rather quickly, right, if that was not actually work that you did. And so that is extremely important. I think the only other thing that I would add to what was previously said is just that sometimes I think we've made it hopefully very clear that we are interested in seeing process work, right? And work that shows not just the final, pretty renderings. Because and also feeling comfortable sharing like your life experiences, because sometimes we just see portfolios where it's like all this finished polished work, and then at the end there'll be like maybe one little thumbnail that shows some of the process work that's like that right there, I want to know that more about that. And so just making sure that you celebrate that. We want to see the way that you're thinking, your experiences, who you are, more so than just a lot of finished polished projects, at least for our department.
No, same for us. Absolutely.
Thank you. All right.
And I mean, if we are closing, I just want to kind of commend everyone for also joining to this session. It shows us that you are invested in and genuinely interested. So I think it's a great sign of your commitment about your own learning experience and your future. So I just wanted to commend you all for joining.
Absolutely. And feel free to follow up with any emails. I think hopefully Jen has shared that with you, or you could find it on our websites. But I know for me, I always love, feel free to reach out, come visit us if you're in the area. We'll have an open house, and later on, both online, but feel free to reach out with any additional questions.
Fantastic. Yes, just email admissions@risd.edu. If you would like me, I can make the connection to Emily and John after this. This session was also recorded, so I can share that recording with you as well. And again, this is just the beginning. We have a full month next month with a ton of events, and hopefully it will all prepare you so you feel confident when you're applying on January 5th. But with that, I just want to thank Emily and John for being here today, and everyone for signing on from wherever you are in the world. And I look forward to seeing you at another session. All right, great.
Thanks, Jen.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Jen.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Have a good day.